Thank you again for joining us to The Only You for a new podcast, which is going to be quite special today. We have a special guest that is going to help us understand a little bit the interaction between art, writing, poetry, and anxiety. So we're going to try to have a pleasant conversation about these topics so we can shed some light into what a psychiatrist thinks about these issues and what a writer thinks about these issues. Hanif, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. It's really a privilege for us to have you here.
Of course. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. I was most curious about, most interested in talking about the relationship between writing and mental health. I'm someone who has anxiety. I was diagnosed with anxiety in my late teens. Mm-hmm. And I'm someone who has kind of used art as a way to articulate those anxieties and make them more tangible.
Correct.
But I think a thing that I always tell people, a thing I get asked a lot when I travel, especially by folks who are younger than me, younger artists, they ask me if art is therapy or if writing is therapy for me. And I always try to say, writing is therapeutic, but, therapy is therapy. Or at least in my experience, therapy is therapy. But also, not everyone can go to therapy. Not everyone can afford therapy. Not everyone has time for therapy.
Correct.
And so I'm wondering if there are ways that you think art can be used as something adjacent to therapy.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if we are to understand anxiety, we have to understand what anxiety is all about to begin with. And then we can get a little bit into art and multiple forms of art. And actually, I have to say that music is one of the best therapies, and we'll get to that a little bit. Anxiety is all about uncertainty. It's about fear. And it's actually genetically determined in your brain because we have to have mechanisms to protect ourselves. So normal anxiety is adaptive, meaning if there's an animal in the wild who's going to eat you, you better have some anxiety, right? You have to have anxiety. So when we talk about anxiety in general, we tend to talk about pathological anxiety, right? So pathological anxiety is too much, too often, and it affects your ability to function. So that's the difference between normal anxiety and pathological anxiety, right? So I'm sure that you have had experience like that in both ways, both normal anxiety that we all humans have, and maybe sometimes when you feel that you're worrying too much to the point that your life changes. You decide to do things differently.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, at least for me, I've had a hard time telling the difference between, or at least at this point in my life, I don't know what an anxiety-less existence would even feel like, And so I do think that there's a type of pathological anxiety that kind of consumes your life until you don't really know what the other side of that is. I know times where I'm feeling less anxious than normal, but I don't think I've ever had a day where I haven't been anxious at all.
Generalized anxiety disorder is what we call when you have pathological anxiety. And it's basically the hallmark of it is excessive worrying. There's always something you're worrying about. And when you have had it for a very long time, that becomes your normal, right? So you're absolutely right. It is difficult to establish a baseline of no anxiety when you have had anxiety all your life. But it is important to understand that anxiety, even in pathological terms, is not always disabling, right? So we learn to live with it. So when you were talking before about therapy, basically we develop our own ways of coping. Therapy in a formal way is kind of like a professional way to guide you into better coping or more adaptive coping. And we usually move into therapy when we feel that the dysfunction is too high. For example, let's say you're worrying so much about raining that if it gets cloudy, you don't get out of the house.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Or you worry so much about your safety that you start changing the patterns of your behavior on a day-to-day basis. So what happens with generalized anxiety is that if you don't deal with it, your life becomes very small because there's so many worries that you have difficulty expanding your environment. Because the opposite of anxiety is risk-taking, right?
Right, yeah.
So if you are to be taking the risk of doing something, whether it's physical or emotional or psychological, like letting somebody know how you feel, right? That's a risk. And if you're extremely concerned about what other people are going to think, then it's going to be hard to take that step. And there's where you can see that therapy is not a dichotomy between coping and formal psychotherapy. Therapy is everything you do
right,
to make yourself function better and make you more adaptive. Because at the end of the day, anything that has to do with mental illness really has to do with functioning.
Well, I think all the time about, so in my work, in my writing work, and in my artistic endeavors, I'm very unafraid of risk, I think I have to kind of function that way in order to continue to push myself as an artist and to push myself as someone who is not stagnant, right? Who's kind of attempting to mine my gifts for what they can be best used for, right? And so when I do get the question about writing as therapy, I am wondering if there is, I'm always wondering if there's an upside to being not at all risk averse in my work, right? And how that reflects on my day-to-day life where I am very risk averse. When I put the paper down or when I walk away from this computer screen or when I step off a stage or whatever, then I kind of return to this normal of being extremely risk averse or kind of drowning in worry. And I'm often wondering if there's a way I can bottle the energy that I bring to my creative work, or what in me fuels my creative work in a way where I don't feel worry. I feel like in that bubble of creativity, I am less worried than I am in every other movement of my day.
You see, and I'm glad you used the word, the bubble of creativity, because next to the bubble of creativity, there's a bubble of misery, right?
Yeah.
And when I talk to my patients, actually, in general, about anxiety, I try to help them understand what is it like to be inside of the bubble of misery, right? And the problem is the longer you are in the bubble of misery, the more comfortable you are with the misery. It means that the misery, the anxiety becomes familiar and it becomes safe. So in order for you to take a step out of the bubble of misery, you really have to take a risk. I mean, a risk of confronting your fear, okay, and learning that nothing happens.
Right.
And
yeah.
that is the most difficult thing for people to understand, because we usually take risks hoping for something positive happening. And what happens is the only positivity that you're going to find over time is that you're not worried.
Right.
But nothing else happens. It's not like you're going to get a prize for taking a risk, right? So it's all internal, and by practicing getting out of the bubble of misery, then you start taking higher and higher risks. And we're talking about very simple things, like saying, I'm going to stay in the house because I'm worried that somebody's going to call and something bad may happen. Then you take this step and say, well, I'm going to get out of the home and find out that nothing happens.
Right.
And the more you do it, the more familiar you are with the other side.
Do you think, too, though, that this is a question of stakes? I think all the time about the stakes of anxiety and the stakes of worry. I think that I am most creatively I desire risk in my work, because if I take a risk and it fails, I can just delete. I can throw away whatever I'm working on and start again on something new later. I think I have the hardest time, and I think a lot of creative people I know have a really hard time attaching the stakes of creativity to real life, even if the stakes are adjacent or even lower, because I worry about everything. I think a lot of people worry about everything. But when I am writing, I'm not worried about making a mistake, because making a mistake means that I just have to start over. And in that starting over, I might find something newer or better to create off of. And I often wonder about applying that or telling myself that all worry is kind of a matter of where the stakes are at, and adjusting myself that way. But I'm not sure that it really works the way I'm thinking of.
It does work if you practice it enough. Meaning, the issue of learning to deal with things in a more adaptive way really requires that you feel comfortable with the risk that you're taking, right? So the stakes are basically a guide in terms of where you want to go with them. When you move it back to creativity, though, creativity is a very lonely process.
Right.
Right? It's like, I guess, it's like getting pregnant, right?
Right, yeah.
There's a whole process that evolves and grows, and then you have the final product, right?
Right.
In that process, there are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be difficulties. There are going to be challenges. But at the same time, you need to understand that it's a very lonely process, because I think in part you feel comfortable with your writing and creativity because you are comfortable with you.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So you are with you. Something that we forget sometimes is that we don't think of ourselves as individual beings that we are with all the time. And I like to tell people that you are with you all the time. You're the only person you're always going to be with. You wake up in the morning with you, and you go to bed with you every night. That's never going to change.
Right.
Right? So learning to appreciate you and your creativity and your values, okay, allow you to feel more comfortable with you. And that in itself is a good way to start taking risks, because you're not taking the risk of exposing yourself, right, or to take a risk of safety. What you're really doing is, I'm taking a risk with me.
Right.
Because I'm with me all the time. And I think that to some degree, the message that we consistently get is that we shouldn't be selfish. And we get confused between doing things for oneself and being selfish. Those are two different things.
What's the difference between those two things?
The different thing is that when you're doing things for you, you're building yourself up so you can give yourself to the world, right? Versus I'm taking something from somebody else, okay, for my own benefit.
Right.
Those are two different things. But we have to, in order for us to be able to give ourselves to the rest of the world, we have to make sure what we have to give.
Right.
Right? And we have to build that. But the message that we get consistently is empty yourself giving to others, and your reward is going to come from that. But we always forget to leave something for ourselves. And in a sense, that leaving something for yourself is part of your safety.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, me and so many folks I know, I don't work like a 9-to-5 schedule. I don't have kind of a normal, I don't leave my house to go to an office, so to speak. My office is sometimes in my office at home, but my office is sometimes in an airplane, and my office is sometimes in a hotel room in the middle of nowhere. My office is sometimes on a stage in front of 100 people or whatever. And I think because of that, it's kind of dislocating, right? And I always forget to, and I know a ton of folks who also kind of live a similar life that I live, where you forget that all of these things are kind of you emptying a part of yourself to give to the world. But I don't take vacations. I don't remember to take vacations, or I don't think about these things, right? I was just thinking today about the last time I went on a vacation that was a determined vacation apart from the world and my work and obligation, and I haven't done it in a long time. And I think that for so much of my life as a working artist, I have felt like, if I take this vacation, what does this mean for not just my work, but, I'm worried about, I get kind of immersed in worry about what I'm missing in my day-to-day life. And so my fear of vacation is even, running up against the wall of anxiety and it's not even about producing work. It's just about like, what am I missing in my everyday life that I've become so comfortable with?
Yeah, one of the phrases one of my professors 30-some years ago used to tell me is that people with anxiety worry about worrying, right? So you worry about what you're going to worry about later on, and it becomes so circular that it becomes difficult to distance yourself from it. So I think that you do have a point when you talk about vacation in particular. Yeah. I think it's important sometimes to remember that, to tell yourself, I'm going to take myself on a vacation, not I'm going to go on vacation.
Right.
Right? Because you're actually taking you, and you may take other people with you, but you're mainly taking you because you want to give you something of value. Right?
Right.
And that becomes, I think, very important. So part of the problem with anxiety is that we tend to project and anticipate into the future our fears, right? So we tend to do a lot of planning because we want to make sure that everything goes the way we're supposed to do it. The problem, and I think that in a way, your comfort with writing and with your creativity, it really has to do with, to some degree, with the fact that you're comfortable expressing your emotions to you and then expressing them to other people. But what happens is when you have to give it to you, right, you have to make the decision, am I worth it?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Am I deserving of? And when I was telling you about giving yourself some of you to you, is because that's what gives you the sense of deserving, right? I'm worth doing it for. I'm not just doing this for altruistic reasons because I want people to know more about music or know more about love or to know more about these things. I'm giving it to myself too. And probably when you're creating, you're in that bubble of happiness,
right? Yeah.
Where you're enjoying with yourself, okay, what you're creating. And I think that's important. The other thing is that when we have anxiety and we start projecting into the future, we start making promises, right? And I'm not much into promises. I don't like them.
Yeah, they're easy to be broken.
Well, not only broken, but I had a famous professor, Dr. Bill Offenkrantz from the University of Chicago. He was a beautiful psychoanalyst. And when I was training with him, he used to tell me, you have to remember that love is a promise that cannot be kept.
Right.
Right? And I think we've talked about this before. And really what it means is that you have to live it every day. So when we say, I'm going to love you forever, and maybe it has to do with something with creativity, it sounds terribly romantic, right? But it's terribly impractical.
It's an impossible thing.
Because it's an impossible thing. So how do we promise to ourselves and to other people today? I'm kind of a realist. It's all there is. Yesterday is a picture in your mind. Tomorrow is a picture that hasn't happened yet. But whatever is going to happen here is going to be influenced by the picture in the past and what you're doing today. So today is where we have to be focusing when we deal with anxiety. Not what's going to happen tomorrow, but how are you coping today?
Right.
Right.
You talked about music as therapy, and I kind of wanted to ask you about that in terms of both making music and consuming music. I think that music has been a huge part of my understanding of the world. I wasn't very good at making music, but I'm somewhat good at consuming music and considering how music impacts the lives outside of the people making it. So I'm wondering how you view music as therapy.
Music is therapy. That is it's an interesting concept, and I'm going to try to explain to you, like, history-wise. I think that rhythm, in particular, is probably one of the oldest ways of soothing, right? I mean, you can think about people, I don't know, 15,000 years ago making some noises, right?
Yeah, beating on a table.
That it felt good to them, right? So I think that there is, and actually if you start looking at the brain in particular, biologically speaking, is rhythmic. The whole electrical activity that is happening in the brain has to have rhythm, coherence. It has to be symmetric. So when I explain to people how the brain functions, I tell them it's like a symphony, right? In which different instruments have to be going in and out at different stages, different levels, different volumes and all of that. And in order for the brain to work well, all of these instruments have to be going in and out like a symphony in a way that it sounds right. When the brain is not working right, and actually that can be measured, it's like sound that doesn't sound like music. It's not symmetric, it's not coherent, it's not rhythmic, right? So if you think about the brain having that, and you start looking at from the outside, how rhythm, okay, and symmetry of music and melody suits the brain. So there's a connection, I think, between what happens with music and what happens with the brain. And there are actually productions actually nowadays where you can actually help yourself go to sleep, help yourself relax.
Yeah.
And they're very useful. So I think that everybody has their own tolerance to music. Everybody has a different tolerance to certain rhythms and others. And I think the culture has a lot to do with it. Okay, how you grew up with music, what kind of music you listen to. But you end up liking music, right? So I find music probably one of the best tools for me to concentrate well, right? I mean, I have this thing that if I'm working, whether I'm writing or I'm working in the computer, I have to be listening to something. It kind of helps my brain stay at a certain level of calmness, if you may, right? So I think that music becomes a very good way, and may have become to you too, a very good way to relax. And to find yourself not overexcited, not over anxious, right? So I think that music has a lot more to give us, okay? And I don't think that music is a great business used by accident.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Music is there because people like it. People like to listen to it, okay? And it's not just about commercialization. It's about what is happening when music gets to your brain. And I think that that's a very useful tool.
What do you listen to when you work? What do you have on?
It depends. I mean, I like to listen to my old music, both Spanish and English. And it can go anywhere from mariachi to Pink Floyd, right? I mean, I have a very wide range of music that I like. And I think there's also a connection between music and mood, right? Where is your mood at certain points is going to dictate what kind of music you want to listen to.
Of course.
Yeah.
What do you do as someone who spends a lot of time in this world of getting people to, or trying to motivate people to worry less or de-stress or, get to the heart of what their best selves possibly could be? What are the things that you do to de-stress? And like, where does the doctor go to find healing?
Wow, that's quite a question. Of course, during our training, we had to go to some degree of therapy ourselves. I don't know if that happens anymore, excuse me, in psychiatry, but back in the day, we're talking about 70s, 80s, there was a lot of participation. And I found that therapy very useful for me on a day-to-day basis. I move away. I go to the beach and I tend to enjoy solitude. Solitude for me is important. I don't have a problem being with me. It's a little dangerous because then you forget that there's a world out there, that you have to be part of. But I'm very comfortable with myself. And I think that sometimes that becomes avoidance, So you have to be able to recognize at what point you are enjoying solitude and at what point you're avoiding the world in general. Because of my work, I'm not allowed to get disconnected too much because I have to deal with people and emotions every day. I think the challenge for me is when I'm dealing with something very emotionally loaded, and then you start finding yourself being connected to that pain, and how do you have to deal with that? Sometimes you have to talk to a colleague or discuss those things, because there are situations where you're dealing with significant trauma or significant emotional pain, or things that remind you of your own pain, right? Because we all have that, and then we have to learn to cope with that.
Right. Yeah, I've had to get comfortable with solitude, particularly this year, because I'm on the road a lot, and I'm I'm often in hotel rooms alone, and I'm often spending a lot of time alone. And I think I'm wondering if you think that there is a difference between being alone and feeling lonely.
Oh, absolutely.
And what's the difference?
Absolutely. Feeling lonely actually reflects that you're missing something, that there's something in your life that you are hoping for or missing, right? And usually loneliness comes associated with other emotions.
Right. Yeah. I think that oftentimes, like you said, being okay with isolation, being okay with yourself, really, goes hand in hand. And I always think it took me such a long time to understand that, or to get to that point. What are some tips you have for people who are maybe looking to become better with isolation? Like for me, it was just a practice thing where I had to be alone so much that I had no choice but to become comfortable with being alone, right? And I came to celebrate these moments of isolation, or these moments of, it was a chance for me to read, or just really take in the silence. We have a dog now, so even when I'm alone, I'm not alone, it seems. But still, what are some tips you have for people who are perhaps struggling with isolation, or celebrating isolation?
If you're celebrating, is not isolation.
I guess that's probably true. Yeah,
it is solitude.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, am I where I want to be, and am I enjoying myself being where I'm at? You mentioned a dog. I think the dogs are fabulous animals to help you with anxiety and companionship. They're very perceptive, and they kind of recognize your moods and your emotions. So having a dog, having a pet, it becomes a very useful way of coping with anxiety and depression and so on. When you are depressed, when you're sad and you're in a negativity streak, in terms of your life, it feels different than solitude. It really feels, being depressed feels like having the flu without a fever.
Yeah. You're
tired, you're unmotivated, you're achy, you sleep too much, you sleep too little, you eat too much, you eat too little, people bother you.
Yeah.
So that state of mind is very different than the joy of being alone.
Right.
Right. So when you have those symptoms and you have them for a period of time in so much intensity that you don't want to get out of the house, or you start feeling so down that you think that life isn't worth living, then you have to say, wait a minute. Okay, this is not right. This is not me. And the problem is that you start, because of the negativity associated in your mind with depression, you start thinking, what's wrong with me? Am I defective? Is there something wrong with my character? Am I a worthwhile human being at all? And that's a very stinking thinking, if you may, that used to going downhill in the path that in my business, that's where we see the patients most of the time.
Right. With art and with artists, how do you encourage artists to find a release or something pleasurable outside of their art, because I think for me it's easy to just say, well, I love making my art, and so I'm going to just spiral into this because it brings me this immediate pleasure. The problem with that, and I think it's not now, but in my younger days of art making, I would use the art as the soul therapeutic thing that I had, where if I was feeling down, I would just create. And, that would lead to some habits of just like staying up all hours of the night working and not sleeping. So feeding into some of those things that you were talking about, right? Like not realizing that I was actually depressed and just trying to work my way through it, but still dealing with all those symptoms of depression. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughtful advice for artists struggling who are using just their art to cope. Is there another way out of that, or is there a better path?
Well, you see, in my experience, and I've treated artists in the past, painters, writers, you have to separate those artists that have a mental disorder, like depression, okay, bipolar disorder and so on, from the ones who don't. Because what happens is those who have a mental disorder may be utilizing the art as a way of coping with their mental illness. So you're gonna actually perceive their art, okay? You're gonna perceive their mental illness in their art.
Right, see the art through the lens of
Exactly.
Yeah.
The artists that don't have that is normal, let's say, which is kind of a difficult word to define in my business. What's normal? We've never defined that. So the closest we get to normal is whatever is not abnormal, right? Which is most of the people. Then you have to remind them, I think, number one, that art is not your life, okay? Art is an expression of you, okay, that gets communicated in different ways. But you can't make any one single aspect of your life, because then what you're doing becomes more important than your being.
Right.
So it's very important to remind yourself, I'm not what I do. I am, and then I do. So in defining the who am I, okay, is where the artist needs to start exploring and maybe become a better artist, right? And be able to expose themselves into the art with more fluidity, if you may, because they're not defining themselves based on what they do. And that's very common. I mean, it's actually much more common nowadays than it used to be, okay? I think there's a lot more pressure for the artist on producing, okay, on doing versus being. And there's got to be a balance, right, between those two. Because I treat kids, and some of those kids are very artistically talented. Invariably, when I ask a kid, ages 12 to 18, what makes you valuable? The invariable answer that I get is, I'm a good painter. Mm-hmm. I'm a good writer. I'm a good singer. But so wait a minute, but who are you if you don't have that?
Right.
They cannot answer that question.
Do you think that's hard? It's hard for artists to answer that, though, because we live in a society that's so dominated by a hunger for production, right? So if people don't produce, they don't feel worthwhile. I say this as someone who, as a 16 to 17, 18-year-old, definitely thought that my main worth was, at that point, sports, how good I was at sports. And I think early on in my art-making life, I definitely thought my worth was tied to not just what I was producing, but how frequently I was producing art. Now, I'm older, I've got more priorities than I have, but I think that it's hard. It can be hard, I think, for an artist or anyone who's creative to kind of get to the core of who they are and what their core values are, what they bring to the world beyond what they produce, when the world is kind of leaning on them to produce things, to make answers for problems they didn't create, or to be in conversation with like a larger or more difficult thing than what they're trying to do.
I think it would be extremely easy to say, don't pay attention to the demands the world is putting on you. And there's got to be a balance. You have to produce if you want to support yourself, right?
Right.
The problem is when you start defining production, okay, as my value as a human being, right? So it becomes a little more difficult, okay, in that sense, to define yourself based on what you do. So let me try to explain this to you. In reality, when I ask a kid or an artist what makes you valuable, what I'm asking is, what drives you to do what you do, right? Yes, you have to produce because you have to eat and you have to have a job and you have to support yourself. And the world is going to be demanding more and more of you. But what drives you to do what you do is the same as what makes you a valuable human being. And the answer is in the question, your values. Right. So what are your values as an artist, right? What are the values that drive you to do what you do? I don't know, your ability to be caring and loving and kind and compassionate, industrious, driven, understanding, empathic, sympathetic, all of those things. Because what happens is that the artist ends up feeling they're not worth anything if they're not producing. And you have to remind people you're valuable because of who you are, because your values define you, not your doing. When you fall into the trap of believing that you are worth what you do, then you're worth nothing when you do nothing.
Right. Cool. That is all I had.
Okay.
Questions-wise.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.
This has been great.
Really? Maybe we should do it more often. Maybe we can talk to some other topics, but it was a pleasure being with you, Hanif. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you, Dr. Amezcua. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for being with us again today. I'm sure this is going to be an enlightening conversation for many of you, and we hope that you can connect with us. Go to the website, subscribe to our podcast, and we'll stay in touch with you with the next one. Thank you.